Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host, her favourite gym run quote is "work harder on yourself than you do on your job," Leanne Hughes.
Hello everyone, I'm your host Leanne Hughes and I'm here to help you develop and deliver workshops that kill. I hope you're having a wonderful week and kicking a few goals, ticking some items off your bucket list, or making plans to at least. Now, as I've explored in earlier episodes, when you're up delivering and facilitating workshops, you're not only using a lot of your mental load, but it's a physical job to do as well. Today's guest also recognises that, and he has a pretty cool tool and system of checking in and making sure he handles that physicality. I'll let him explain that in the show and how he does record it all. Now, his name is Tim Pence, and he owns a company called Small Truths. Tim is based in Melbourne, Australia, and I met him recently at a Train the Trainer workshop in Sydney. I remember that during the morning tea break, Tim came up to me and said, "Oh, you must have some influencing strengths in your top 5. And that's when I instantly recognized that this guy spoke my language. We bonded over chatting about how much we love the Clifton Strengths Finder tool, and I thought he'd be great to have on the show. Tim's entire career has focused on human development and performance improvement, and he channels this into the areas of leadership development, culture change, coaching, personal diagnostics, and targeted skill development. He has worked with incredibly diverse populations along the way, which have helped him to consider, reflect on, and adapt to various perspectives. On more than a few occasions, Tim has been called the smiling assassin because while he likes to have a bit of fun, he never forgets that the reason why he's up on stage is to challenge individuals, teams, and organizations and drive their performance outcomes. On this show, we also explore neuroscience and neuroleadership and how it helps to communicate with people who need that scientific data. We explore storytelling, and Tim also shares his advice for you, a first-time facilitator. As always, if you'd like to connect with the show when the conversation is over, join the free Facebook community on Facebook, obviously, called The Flip Chart. Otherwise, I'd love to see you on Instagram. I'm looking to engage with cool facilitators and listeners all around the world. So shoot me a DM on there, take a screenshot of the show that you're listening to, and I will repost it as well. You can tag me and follow or DM me at Leanne Hughes. If you'd like to connect with Tim or find any of the resources mentioned in this one, you can find all of the details on the show notes for this episode at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 56. Now, on to the show. Thank you for joining us on the First Time Facilitator podcast, Tim Pence. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne, for having me.
Now, Tim, we met in Sydney about a month ago, I think it was, and Rayleigh Hobson was the one who introduced us, and she was pretty excited about connecting us both. We had a really great conversation around New York City, that's where you're originally from, as well as the Clifton Strengths tool. But I didn't really get a chance to hear a bit about your background and your career pivots that led you to where you are today, running your company, Small Truths. I was wondering if you could share your backstory with our listeners.
Sure. The accent is a bit of a bummer of a birthmark. It sounds like I just got off of the plane yesterday, but I've actually been in Australia since 1995 and was born in New York, as you said, and moved here 26 years ago. And career pivots. I guess my career pivot started in university. I sort of had the great fortune of moving into my dorm and having a guy called a graduate advisor live on the first floor. He was supposed to provide us with academic assistance, and he really provided me with world assistance. And he just set me off on an adventure that has continued for my entire life. I'll try to make this as short and potted as history. But he was this African-American man that sort of looked like he walked out of a Ralph Lauren catalog or something like that. He could not get a more preppy person in the world. And so then immediately I was just like, oh my God, this is fitting with what I thought of growing up. And I just sort of blurted out, I go, you're only the 5th Black person I've ever talked to. And he just laughed hysterically. But it was in a really loving way. And he said, we'll have to do something about that. And he had a connection with the admissions program. So a few weeks later, he got me to sort of volunteer to take part of what was called Black admissions, where they were trying to get a larger number of African Americans to come to the university. And it was a pivotal moment for me because suddenly I was in this room where no one else looked like me. And sort of the penny dropped for me. And I just oh my God, this is what a lot of people are feeling every day. And I'm just sort of overwhelmed feeling like this for a couple of hours. But it was fantastic. And it just was the bug that I needed. And then it made me go to grad school, which was very challenging, sort of about the way that I had a great professor there who challenged me to say, why do you believe what you believe? And sort of through that pushing, it made me unpack the fact that I didn't really know why I believed what I believed. I just sort of had picked up what my parents said. And so then I went to California after that because I thought I want to work in a more multicultural society and sort of see what that does for me. And I loved it. And then my next job sort of was working outside of LA, where I worked with a deaf and hearing impaired sort of population and learned sign language. And that pushed me outside of my comfort zone. But I was loving it even more. So I said, then an opportunity came up to go to Australia. So I said, yes, live outside of my culture. That would be the ultimate way of sort of, seeing the world from a different perspective. And on and on and on. And I think that is one of the reasons why I love facilitation, because it continually brings me access to all these different people who have different stories, and I just eat it up. I love it. So I feel like I provide a service, but I feel like I get something amazing back by doing it as well.
It is definitely a job that gives you the flexibility to travel and to work with different audiences. I had a guy on the podcast in the early days, Scott Amy. He says that everyone's really different, every workshop that he runs, because of the audience, the stories that come out. So it is a role which has a lot of flexibility and can take you far and wide. I also noticed on your website that you are a bit of an introvert as well. And so it's an interesting career path because facilitators were usually standing up, in the front of a room, and you speak as well. So how do you balance being an introvert with also being the person that has to provide, the crowd a lot of energy, and how do you conquer your fears and get up there?
Again, it's a background thing, and I'm fortunate in that my dad worked for a big sort of oil company growing up, where he got transferred every 18 to 24 months. And I think that sort of my parents sort of tweaked early on that sort of, wow, if we don't help Tim out, he's on each one of these movies just going to sit in his room and not make any friends. So they signed me up for some acting classes and improv classes. And that, I think, was the best thing I could have done to help me, feel more comfortable being around others and sort of, just sort of taking a risk and having a go and sort of putting myself out there. And in fact, I continued to do that into adulthood. And I had a great acting professor when I took a class, and he just pulled me aside one day and he goes why are you getting so anxious and sort of nervous around doing these assignments? And I just I don't want to screw up. I just don't want people to think less of me. And he just said, Tim, they will never know you. He goes, I want you to think of every sort of session as a performance, sort of like you may bomb in a particular performance and you can learn from that performance in terms of what insights do you want to take from that to improve your performance going next time. But he goes, they will never know you as a human being. It is just impossible for them to know you. So he goes, if you just give yourself permission to just think of it as a performance rather than some sort of thumbs up or thumbs down on you as a human being, it can be quite liberating. And I think that was the turning point for me where I thought, yeah, he's right. right. This is kind of a ludicrous sort of self-talk proposition that, I'm holding for myself. It's tied up in perfectionism and things like that. So yeah, that was it. And I still recommend to anybody today that if you want to improve your facilitation, then sign up for an acting class or sign up for an improv class, because it just will give you all of the skills you need to be able to sort of pivot in the moment and to feel more comfortable sort of taking a risk and changing up your approach.
I agree with that. And I definitely should do an improv. You're not the first guest that's mentioned that served them really well, both acting and the improv, because facilitation really is sometimes about thinking on your feet and being in the moment. So I guess the question is, that's one key skill that you've recommended for people that want to start facilitation. Are there any other sort of key skills that you think are important for people that are interested in being facilitators?
Oh my God. There are so many skills that are required to be a fantastic facilitator, but I think you have to hone your skills and your ability to tell a story. And I think there's a second part about that in terms of you have to sort of learn, or you have to sort of realize that you're not telling the story for yourself, that you're telling the story for your audience. Sometimes I sit in the audience listening to other facilitators, and I'm just sitting there going like, how is this moving forward? The learning, yes. I just feel like you are sort of going on and on about, who you are. It's about saying, how does this story sort of advance the learning? And so you have to be somewhat judicious in your storytelling. And I only tell a story if I feel like it's going to move the lesson forward, I guess, so to speak. I think the other thing that's really important for a facilitator is to exercise a fair amount of self-care. I work for myself now, but when I used to work for a firm and we had to do timesheets, and I know that I was working sometimes 240 hours a month, 260 hours a month. I know that my facilitation suffered during those periods. And so there's a guy out of Monash here in Melbourne, Dr. Craig Hassad. He's got this great saying that says, self-care is not selfish. Self-care is an investment in your capacity to care for others. So I've got that sort of little sign up in my office to remind me of that, because, if I do want to be a great facilitator, then I do have to be in sort of fighting fit sort of condition, I think, because it is a role that takes a lot of energy out of you, particularly for me, sort of as an introvert. So you have to take care of myself. I think there's an element of you have to have like a discipline and focus, because to be at your best, I really do believe that there are very few people that can just show up and wing it. That I think that you do have to think about exactly what you want to say and sort of hone it down in terms of what are the key points that you want to say, in any one of your particular sessions or sub-sessions. I think you have to be really comfortable with sort of vulnerability and sort of making yourself vulnerable in front of the group, because I think that helps to create some of that safety. And I've never done a podcast, so sometimes that little inner critic in my head says, do you need to shut up? Am I going on too long in my answers, Leanne?
No, this is perfect. I'm taking notes. I'm nodding my head. Yeah, that's the thing with podcasting as an interviewer, because I've got to be pretty quiet while I listen to you. But if you were to look at me right now, I'd be nodding and going, yeah, I agree with all those points. Particularly on the self-care note, I've got a question for you now that you own your own business and you get to make choices. Do you sort of cap the number of days in a week that you'd facilitate? So out of a 5-day week, you'd say, look, 3 of those I can, but I won't do a 5-day program. What does self-care look like now that you run your own business?
Self-care for Timothy looks like a work in progress. And it looks like a work in progress because I was so far from self-care for so long that those are deep neural pathways that I'm still trying to unlearn. And I think that I get into a bit of problem sometimes because I think, I'm not working as much as I used to work at the consulting firm. So that must be sort of good and that must be self-care. Whereas that's not necessarily the case. Just because it's less than doesn't mean that it's the right amount. But the biggest thing I try to do, and I think that the thing that sort of killed me is when I worked for somebody else, that I would do the full facilitation during the day. And then I thought that the second shift would happen sort of at night. And that's where you would answer the sort of 100 organizational sort of emails that came in during the day, or you were expected to provide sort of content for a proposal that was being put in or for some sort of internal thing. And I think that was the thing that killed me. So that is one of the rules that I hold for myself, is that if I facilitate during the day, then I do maybe sort of a half an hour. I cap myself at doing that work, answering emails at the end of the day, because I know that if I don't, then I'm not going to get that time to recover. And that cumulatively will, bite me in the butt going forward. The other thing that I do is I'm just like a total nerd. And I know that I have to nerd out around this because I know that I'm really bad at it. I've got a self-care spreadsheet. And so I track.
That's cool. What does that look like?
It looks like a whole bunch of dorkiness. So one of the things I do, I measure my weight every day. I measure sort of whether or not I've done my 30 minutes of mindfulness every day. I sort of measure my alcohol consumption, when I'm actually eating, and sort of, whether or not I'm, having days where I'm eating lots of the morning, the deadly morning and afternoon teas, that sort of come with sort of facilitation. And then I've just set it up so that it's got little averages so I can sort of track it over time rather than obsessing about a particular day. And when I feel like I'm not leaving some of the residual effects of the day, like I hold tension in my chest. And so like sometimes at the end of the day, like even when I'm sitting and having downtime, if I start to feel it in my chest, I take out my spreadsheet and I say, let's look at your numbers. 9 times out of 10, I realize that I have fallen off the wagon, where I haven't done as much mindfulness as I've said that I wanted to do, or sort of, I have eaten a lot more of those morning and afternoon teas, and sort of I've noticed that my weight has gone up, or I realized that I've compensated by drinking sort of more. I've had more, my alcohol sort of intake averages have started to creep up in the last sort of few weeks. And sort of I immediately see the connection between I understand sort of why I'm starting to see the physical effects of this, is because I've sort of stopped being present in the moment and sort of actually looking at those cumulative sort of choices that I'm making at any one time.
I feel like you need to sell this spreadsheet. I feel there's an opportunity in this, because where did you get the idea for it? I'm just curious.
At a very, very young age, I realized that I was not very good at detail. And I had a number of sort of my early supervisors said, Tim, sort of, listen, you're a great guy, but sort of, if you sort of don't start to get a little bit better at sort of managing sort of the detail of life, sort of you're going to hit a ceiling. You're not going to be able to advance. And I realized at a very young age. And one of the things that I've, as you said, sort of in your opening, we both love strengths. And I really loved that sort of in their research, they said sort of don't obsess with the weakness, but don't ignore them either. And they sort of came up with these 5 things that you should do. And sort of one of them really appealed to me, which is said, use a weakness to manage your strength. And sort of one of my strengths is input, which means I'm a ravenous reader, sort of like I'm a Kindle junkie, I can download 3 books in a week sometimes. And I've looked at all those self-help books around sort of managing detail or managing your day. They all have these robust plans. And I always look at them and go, there is no way in hell that I would do that. Like, that is not me. But what I have done is I cherry pick an idea from those many, many books I read. And I've cobbled together this Frankenstein sort of monster of things that work for Tim around sort of managing, details and the things that I don't find as exciting or sexy. And that was one of the things that I knew that if I didn't track it, I wouldn't act on it because, I would forget it. And I hate timesheets, but I love the discipline that comes from timesheets. And so that's where where I've now left a consulting firm, and I hated timesheets when I was in a consulting firm, I still maintain it for my self-care regime because I know that there is something that comes from that discipline that is quite healthy.
Yeah. There's a really great quote about discipline can set you free. which sounds counterintuitive, but I completely agree with it. It's definitely something I need to work on, as well as my lack of attention to detail. I think we're strength twins on that. I really am not good with the detail. So I agree. That's why I was so curious about this checklist, because I think it sounds like a really simple way to every day just track it as you go so it doesn't seem like a big chore. And I like that you work on the law of averages as well. I'm pretty sure my weekends you'd see a bit of a growth in that alcohol column. So you mentioned input was one of your top 5. What are your other strengths? And can you share with our listeners the value that you see in this Clifton Strengths tool? You mentioned it, how it's helped you personally. How do you use it with teams and people working in organizations?
Yep, I'm a big fan of the Gallup tool, and I've taken the diagnostic many, 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 many times over the years. And I did that because when I first started working with the tool, participants, very rightly sort of asked me, like, Tim, if I take this again, would I get a different set of strengths? And I'll go, I don't know. I go, I'll do that. And so I started to do that, and it just became a habit. And I did it year after year. So over that time, I've seen 8 strengths appear into the top 5, and the ones that appear most regularly are strategic, input, futuristic, individualization, and achiever. Now, that's my strengths. And then you also asked about what do I see as the value in doing it? Yeah. So from an individual basis, I think that it's fantastic because it makes sense from a neuroscience perspective. Neuroplasticity requires you to lay down new pathways, and sometimes that requires a fair bit of effort, particularly if you're trying to sort of unlearn something you've been doing for a very long time. Whereas if you focus on something that you already exceed at, pretty much all of your additional effort goes straight to the bottom line because that's something where you already do well. So I think that it benefits the individual, but it also benefits the organization, because if you can get people to do more of what they're good at in their own role, that's going to add value. If you can get people to think about how do I offer up more of this strength to my team, the team's going to get that value. If you ask yourself, how can I offer this more up to the organization in which I'm part of? Again, that's going to go straight to the bottom line. So I think that that's great. I sometimes use the tool as a companion piece to other diagnostics. Like I love the human synergistics LSI tool, but sometimes when people get their results and let's say it's a sea of red and green, which means that people are finding them to sort of demonstrate, very defensive sort of behaviors, whether passive or, defensive behaviors, or I don't want to get into too much tool because people may not know what the side tools are all about. But it gives people, even if you get a result that is quite challenging, then I can always say, let's go back to your strengths results, though, because this is your life preserver. Let's look at how you can use these strengths in pursuit of closing the gap. Or let's look at how we can use your strengths to start to act in more constructive ways. And it just starts to make them feel like less of a loser. Kind of like, oh my God, I have value. I may be getting this really confronting result, but it's not all dire because I have this core that I can sort of draw upon that's going to allow me to do the work that I need to do. And with teams, it's very similar. I think that if people can begin to think of themselves not just about themselves, but how can they offer themselves up and add value to the team, then I think that allows people to foster that psychological safety. Like I add value, sort of not just I add value from an individual basis, but sort of, if I wasn't here, the team would not be as strong because I add this to the team, or sort of I counter so-and-so's weaknesses, or sort of my ability to round out my leader allows her or him to be a better leader. So again, I think it helps to create that sense of belonging. And again, it fosters that psychological safety, where again, if people feel psychological safety, they are more likely to realize their full potential.
Yeah, I really like that you overlay the different tools. Yeah, I guess with LSI as well, because if you are confronted, it's a bright red circle. Like that's, you might see that the good thing about the strengths approach is that it is positively framed language as well. So everyone sort of walks away going, oh, wow, you're right. This is how I contribute. This is what the value that I offer. A few times in this episode, you've mentioned the words neuroplasticity and neural pathways. I was wondering if you could share with our listeners a bit about the whole neuroscience movement and how it's coming into leadership, so neuro leadership as well. I know you're doing a bit of work in that space. Why is it so exciting in 2019?
A few years back, in the first year that I went out on my own, I suddenly had all of this free time because, I wasn't booked out 110% of the time. So I went back to school and I did a 2-year degree in what's called the neuroscience of leadership. Sort of it was offered through Middlesex University. And I absolutely loved every single moment of it. And sort of what did I get out of it? It's just, it's really, really sad what I got out of it, but it's really, really good, is that I think that if you can articulate to a senior leader, and sometimes I'll have to keep this sort of very sort of vague, but I worked with this senior. He was the CEO of a company. And when I was meeting for him the first time to talk about this culture change we're going to do, he sort of led me into his office and he shut the door and he said, before we start, I just want to put it out there. He goes, I don't give a shit about this people shit. I'm just doing this to shut people up because this keeps coming up in our sort of engagement survey that people are dissatisfied. So I'm just doing this program so I can be seen to be doing something about it. And I was just sitting there going, oh my God.
Oh gosh. Crazy.
And Tim's inner critic going, so where do I go from here?
Yes.
And I said, okay. I worked with him, sort of engaged with him. Then I went back to him after I'd gone through the course and I began to explain, instead of just saying, why were we doing coaching as part of the program? I was then able to go back and say, here from a brain perspective is what coaching is doing to your brain versus telling, asking versus telling. If you are truly interested in maximizing performance for your organization, then don't you want to create the conditions inside people's brains that will set them up to use the full powers of their brain in pursuit of your strategy, in pursuit of your agenda? And he looked at me and he just said, I still don't think I give a damn about the people shit, but now you've convinced me that we need to do these things to sort of realize return on investment, to get the best outcome. And I just thought, how sad is it? You don't want to care about people or you don't want to put in place things that are going to sort of nurture and develop people unless you can hear that there's a scientific sort of background for it. But nonetheless, I do come across people like that today. And it's not just the senior leaders, it's people, it's participants sort of in the room as well, where they go, I've been to a lot of these workshops before. I haven't, this is the first time sort of someone has explained the science behind it. And sort of now I'll walk through being more likely to do something about it because it's science. And this is one of the things that sort of I'm torn about this. And this is one of the things where I would argue, not argue, but sort of I would have healthy conversations with my people. The course that I went in that neuroscience course, where some of them said, we should not talk about anything that hasn't come from like a neuroscience study. Shouldn't talk about things that happened pre-neuroscience research. And I would just look at them like, you are mad. I go, you're saying that we shouldn't leverage or sort of value the wisdom of human observation that has been happening since the dawn of time. The Greeks observed things and find truths that we still use to these days. So you see this in sort of Eastern philosophies. And just because now we can look at an MRI scanner and say, we see what it's doing to the brain, that doesn't discount the fact that people came to that realization long, long ago. And now it's just validated. And we know why it actually works. But it still had value. And in fact, that most of the neuroscience stuff that I learned in the course was not earth-shattering or anything like that. But I would say now I understand why this works, Now I understand why positive psychology works, does this to the brain. Now I understand why coaching works. It does this to the brain. Now I understand why a strengths-based approach works because it does this to the brain. But those things, I think, had already had value prior to prying into the brain and seeing what was being done and why it was adding value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was sort of already thinking, you mentioned that senior leader, where I've seen data and fact like this really play out as well when people, we're talking about soft skills, also people that are technically minded. So engineers, accountants, people that are heavy in the analytical data. And even on the disc profile, they'd probably be the C's on the disc profile. They just want the fact. And so it's just probably a way of just us guiding our communication so we can influence people that need the data, the analysis, the scientific research to back things up. So, yeah, that's really cool.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just because I lost a lot of time over the years judging those people and thinking it shouldn't be this way. You know, you shouldn't have to convince them. Whereas it's taken me a very long time just to accept that that's where they're at, Tim. So meet them where they're at. And instead of wasting all this time just saying, judging them where they just should accept it or they should see value in that, just say, okay, that's where they're at. And that's where I find that the neuroscience stuff is very helpful because it allows me to meet them where they're at and just not have judgment about that and just accept that that's where they're at. And this is how I can meet them where they're at.
Well, thank you for sharing that small truth with us. I love that you mentioned that you love storytelling. And even at the beginning of this podcast, you were mentioning the time at university where you met the African-American guy that had a huge influence on your career trajectory.
Cedric.
Yeah, I've got to ask if you've got a story that you can share about possibly a time where things haven't worked out during a workshop and what you've learned from that experience. I find I get a lot of learning out of hearing how other people have had these moments. So have you had one?
To be perfectly honest, that question did provoke a lot of thinking and a lot of storytelling in my head. But for some reason, it kept bringing up sort of memories for me that were more, I guess, sort of leadership type experiences rather than sort of that happened in facilitation rooms, so to speak. So would you want to hear one of those?
Yeah. I mean, I love hearing stories about leaders gone wrong. But anyway.
This is a leadership story that I tell a lot. And it's a leadership story that happened not in a facilitation room. It didn't happen in an office space. It happened in a supermarket. And it happened when I was in grad school. So myself and two of my best friends from university, we all applied and got into the same graduate program, which was up in sort of Vermont. And for people that are not familiar with the U.S., sort of Vermont just sort of sits right sort of on the border of Canada. And sort of it's very, very rural. I think there's like 3 times as many cows as people in Vermont. And sort of in 1991, when we all went, it was not a very diverse place to be. And that's relevant to my story because my two best friends, Melanie is African-American and Ray is Asian-American. And so we arrive there and we go to sort of this supermarket, Martin's supermarket, to stock up on stuff, you know, to put in the fridge. And we've all got full carts. And so we get to the checkout counter. And Melanie goes first. And so the checkout person puts everything through. It's going beep, 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 you know, stuff like that. And then she says, well, we need to see 2 forms of, you know, ID. And so we're thinking, well, that sounds a bit full on. But Melanie gets out her ID. She puts her driver's license. She puts her university ID. So the woman looks at both of the IDs, looks at Melanie, looks at the ID, looks at Melanie. She grabs this microphone and says, ID check on aisle 5, ID check on aisle 5. So the woman comes over and then the manager looks at her IDs, looks at Melanie, looks at the ID, looks at the, you know, Melanie looks at the ID, signs off on the basis of on the check, walks away. So Ray's not an idiot. He's been paying attention. He has his 2 IDs ready, puts them up on these little thing. She looks at the ID. She looks at Ray, looks at the ID, looks at Ray. She pulls up that microphone and says, ID check on aisle 5. The manager comes back, looks at Ray, looks at the ID, looks at Ray, looks at the ID, signs off on a little check. Tim has been paying attention, puts his IDs up. She leans forward and says to me, Sugar, we don't need those from you. And my response at that particular point in time was, oh, okay. And so there's a lot going on in my head, but that was the sum total of what I was able to get out of that head was, oh, it's okay. And so we went to the car instead of nobody's saying anything. It's completely in silence. We put all the stuff in the car. We drive back to campus. Not a word is said in the car. So we get back to the apartment. We're putting things away. Nothing is being said. The tension is enormous at that point. And so it's at the breaking point for Tim finally. And so Tim says, my God, that was so wrong. And I said, why didn't you say something? And they in stereo sort of turned to me and say, no, Tim, why didn't you say something? And they walked out of the apartment and they left me there, and they left me there for quite some time. And that was just sort of a devastating piece of feedback to receive. But at the same time, that was the feedback that I needed to receive at that time, because I was the one that had the privilege in that situation. I was the one that had the power in that particular situation. And here I was having the mindset that I'm outsourcing that to the people that are being on the receiving end to do something about it. That is a moment that is etched into my mind. And even though that happened many, 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 many years ago, it's something I carry with me and I do use in my facilitation. And I bring to my facilitation where I'm just like, sort of, you are there in service of the audience. You are the one that has the power. Sort of, you have a lot of privilege in this particular situation. How are you using your privilege? How are you using your power to advance the learning and sort of support the people in the room who may not have as much power or as much privilege in this particular sort of setting?
Yeah, the second you step up in front of a workshop room, you've got that status. And like you said, that immediately brings with it that privilege and power. So it is something that we need to be very careful about when we are facilitating. Through this episode, you've talked about quite a few different things: your self-care checklist, the strengths tool, neuroscience, the importance of storytelling, which you've just demonstrated in that really beautiful story, which has a lot of great messages about speaking up. What is one piece of advice that you'd offer to a first-time facilitator that's listening in?
Oh, my goodness. I guess, well, aside from the other ones that I would say, go and do the acting class, because that will certainly help you get more comfortable. I would say be a better storyteller. But for a first-time facilitator, I would say just hold this mental frame for yourself that it's like a servant mindset, that you are there in service of this group. So it's not about you. Every one of the things that you ask yourself, all the things in terms of the way that you structure the learning experience, should be about sort of how is this serving the interests and the outcomes of those folks that are sitting in front of you. Because if you're not, I don't think you're going to be able to deliver the outcomes that you need to deliver for that individual and for that individual's team and or organization.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I'm actually finalizing some content on a conference I'm running next week. And I think when I initially started developing it, I was thinking about, what do I know that I can share? But it was the wrong question. The question I should be asking is the one that you've just mentioned. So how can I be of service to this audience? And it's so different when you flip it. It's actually less pressure then, because you're like, oh yeah, that'll be great for them. That'll help. I think you can really get into really some good brainstorming when you ask that type of question. Finally, Tim, if people want to contact you and find out more about Small Truths, where can they find you?
They can find my website, which is a vintage website. Well, that's the way I'm trying to reframe it to make me feel better about the fact that I haven't changed it in 8 years. So they can find that on www.smalltruths.com.au. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. If you just go Tim Pence, Small Truths, you'll find me there as well.
Perfect. And we'll link up to all those links and some of the other resources that you've mentioned on the show notes for this episode. Tim, thanks again so much. It was great having a follow-up chat with you. And it's so great. You left consulting and now you're doing your own thing. You're very busy. And I love hearing that because I'm on the same sort of path. So well done on everything you've done. Thanks for sharing all the information with our listeners, and all the best.
And I would like to especially thank you, because many of my clients have been pushing me, particularly Ray Lee Hobson, which you mentioned at the beginning of this, has been pushing me to do something like this for years. And I set it as a goal that I wanted to do this. And sort of you have enabled me to tick that off my list in February. So.
Yay! Now you're going to make it 3 podcasts this year.
Maybe next year.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Tim.
Thank you, Leanne.
Thanks so much for tuning in to First Time Facilitator. If you liked the episode, please share it with your mates or subscribe to the podcast feed in iTunes. Till next time.